John Doe stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a hollow thud that seemed to echo across the vast expanse of his inheritance. The ranch stretched before him like a dream half-remembered, its weathered buildings and sun-bleached fences telling stories he couldn't quite grasp. The lawyer's letter crinkled in his coat pocket as he surveyed the property that had been left to him by a grandfather he barely remembered, a man whose face had been lost to the fever that had nearly claimed John's life as a child. The main house stood solid against the horizon, its wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of years and weather. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, suggesting life within, though John had expected the place to be empty. His grandfather had been dead for 3 months, according to the legal documents, and the lawyer had made no mention of anyone else living on the property. The mystery deepened as he approached the front steps, his spurs jingling softly with each stride. Before he could knock, the heavy wooden door swung open to reveal a woman of perhaps 45 years, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands wiping themselves on a flour-dusted apron. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably under her gaze. Behind her, John could make out the shapes of other women moving about in the dim interior of the house. "You must be John," the woman said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and wariness. "We've been waiting for you." She stepped aside to allow him entry, and as he crossed the threshold, 6 more women emerged from various rooms throughout the house. They ranged in age from perhaps 20 to 50, each bearing the marks of hard work and harder times. Their faces showed a combination of hope and apprehension as they gathered around him in the main room. "I'm Jane Doe," the older woman continued, though John noted the irony of their shared surname. "Your grandfather spoke of you often, told us you would come when the time was right. He said you would take care of what he couldn't finish." Her words carried weight that John didn't understand, and he found himself studying each face in turn, searching for clues to the puzzle that his inheritance had become. The women introduced themselves in turn: Mary, with her auburn hair and gentle smile; Sarah, whose calloused hand spoke of countless hours of labor; Rebecca, young but with old eyes that had seen too much; Elizabeth, tall and dignified despite her worn clothing; Catherine, whose nervous fidgeting suggested a troubled past; and finally Ruth, the youngest, who barely met his eyes as she whispered her name. Each carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, yet John sensed an underlying current of fear that ran through the group like an underground stream. "I'm afraid I don't understand," John admitted, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "My grandfather never mentioned any of you in his letters, and the lawyer said nothing about anyone living here. What exactly did he promise you?" The question hung in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. Jane exchanged glances with the other women before gesturing toward a worn leather chair that had clearly been his grandfather's favorite. "Sit, John. There's much you need to know, and little time to explain it all. Your grandfather was a good man, perhaps the only good man any of us had ever known. He offered us sanctuary when we had nowhere else to turn, promised us protection when we were defenseless, and gave us hope when we had none left." As John settled into the chair, he noticed how it seemed to embrace him, molded by years of his grandfather's presence. The women arranged themselves around the room, some sitting on the worn sofa, others perching on wooden chairs or leaning against the mantelpiece. Their positioning reminded him of a council of war, each woman alert and ready for whatever might come. "We all came here under different circumstances," Mary began, her voice soft but steady. "Some of us fled in the dead of night, others arrived bloodied and broken. Your grandfather never asked questions, never demanded explanations. He simply opened his door and his heart to women who had nowhere else to go." Her words painted a picture of his grandfather that differed greatly from the stern, distant figure John barely remembered from his childhood. Sarah picked up the thread of the story. "He told us that someday his grandson would come, a man who would understand the burden of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He said you had a fever as a child, that it took away your memories of this place but couldn't touch your heart." John felt a chill run down his spine at her words, remembering the weeks of delirium that had stolen much of his early childhood from him. The afternoon wore on as the women shared fragments of their stories, painting a picture of abuse and desperation that had driven them to seek refuge at the ranch. John learned of husbands who had used their fists as readily as their words, of men who had seen their wives as property to be owned and controlled rather than partners to be cherished. His grandfather had apparently made it his mission to provide a safe haven for these women, creating a community built on mutual support and protection. As evening approached, Jane rose and moved toward a large oak desk that dominated one corner of the room. "Your grandfather left something for you," she said, pulling out a leather-bound journal and a collection of legal documents tied with a faded ribbon. "He said you would need these to understand what he had done and what he expected you to do." John accepted the journal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The leather cover was worn smooth by countless readings, and his grandfather's initials were barely visible in the lower right corner. As he opened to the first page, his grandfather's familiar handwriting greeted him like a voice from beyond the grave. "My dear John," the first entry began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the burden I have carried has passed to you. These women are not merely residents of this ranch, they are your family now, as they became mine. Each carries scars both visible and hidden, and each has earned the right to live without fear. I have done what I could to protect them, but the work is not finished." Page after page revealed the depths of his grandfather's commitment to these women. He had carefully documented each woman's arrival, the circumstances that had brought her to the ranch, and the steps he had taken to ensure their safety. Legal documents scattered throughout the journal showed property transfers, name changes, and other official papers that created new identities for women who needed to disappear from their old lives. As John read, he began to understand the complexity of what his grandfather had built. This wasn't simply a ranch, it was a carefully constructed refuge that existed in the spaces between law and justice, providing sanctuary for those whom the law had failed to protect. The women had become a family of choice, bound together not by blood but by shared experience and mutual support. The legal documents Jane had given him painted an even clearer picture. His grandfather had meticulously planned for this moment, creating a framework that would allow John to continue the work he had started. Property deeds, bank accounts, and legal guardianship papers all bore John's name, prepared years in advance by a man who had never doubted that his grandson would eventually come home. As John absorbed the magnitude of his inheritance, Ruth approached hesitantly, and whispered that riders were approaching from the east. The peaceful atmosphere in the room shattered instantly, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against John's chest. The women moved with practiced efficiency, some drawing curtains while others positioned themselves near windows and doorways. Their transformation from gentle homemakers to alert sentries was both impressive and heartbreaking. Jane peered through a gap in the curtains before turning back to the group with a grim expression. "Land speculators," she announced, her voice carrying a weight of dread that made John's blood run cold. "3 of them, and they're not here for a friendly visit." The women's faces hardened, and John saw glimpses of the strength that had allowed them to survive their previous ordeals. Heavy boots on the porch announced the arrival of the unwelcome visitors, followed by sharp knocks that sounded more like demands than requests. Jane straightened her shoulders and moved toward the door with the bearing of a queen preparing to face her enemies. "Remember," she whispered to the other women, "we know nothing, we've seen nothing, and we owe them nothing." The 3 men who entered when Jane opened the door were cut from the same cloth expensive suits that couldn't hide their predatory nature, calculating eyes that missed nothing, and smiles that held no warmth. The leader, a thin man with pale skin and cold blue eyes, removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy while his companions flanked him like hunting wolves. "Ladies," the man began, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "I'm Thomas Crawford from the Western Development Company. These are my associates, Mr. Bennett and Mr. Hayes. We're here about some property matters that I believe concern you greatly." His words carried implications that hung in the air like storm clouds, and John felt his grandfather's protective instincts stirring within his own chest. Crawford's gaze swept the room, cataloging details with the precision of a man accustomed to finding leverage in every situation. When his eyes fell on John, they narrowed slightly, as if calculating how this new element might affect his plans. "And you must be the grandson we've heard about, John, isn't it? Your grandfather's death has created some interesting opportunities for discussion." The veiled threat in Crawford's words was clear to everyone in the room. John felt the women's eyes upon him, measuring his response, determining whether he would stand with them or abandon them to face these vultures alone. The weight of his grandfather's journal seemed to burn against his chest where he had tucked it inside his vest. "I'm not sure what business you gentlemen think you have here," John replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "But this is private property, and you weren't invited." He moved to stand beside Jane, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Crawford or his companions. The alignment of forces in the room shifted palpably, and John saw something that might have been hope flicker in the women's eyes. Crawford's smile turned predatory as he reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. "Oh, but we do have business here, Mr. Doe. You see, there are certain irregularities in the property records, certain questions about the legal status of your inheritance, questions that could be resolved much more easily with cooperation than through lengthy court proceedings." Bennett, a heavy-set man with small, cruel eyes, stepped forward slightly. "We also have some interesting information about the previous occupants of this area. Men who owned property, men who had wives, men who seemed to have simply vanished." His words carried an unmistakable threat, and John saw several of the women flinch as if struck. The implications of Bennett's statement hit John like a physical blow. These men knew about the women's past, knew about their disappeared husbands, and were prepared to use that knowledge as a weapon. The careful refuge his grandfather had built was under attack, and John realized that everything the old man had worked for hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Hayes, the third man, had been studying the women's faces throughout the conversation, and now he spoke for the first time. "Funny thing about mine accidents," he said conversationally. "Sometimes they happen in places where there never were any mines. Sometimes the bodies are never found because they were never there to begin with." His words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear and recognition. Jane's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady as she addressed Crawford. "I don't know what you think you know, but these are serious accusations you're making. Accusations that could get a man into trouble if he can't back them up." Her challenge hung in the air between them, but John could see the tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. Crawford's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Oh, Mrs. Doe, if that is indeed your real name, we can back up everything we say. The question is whether you ladies would prefer to discuss this matter privately, or whether you'd like the territorial marshal to conduct his own investigation into the mysterious disappearances of several local men." The standoff continued as each side measured the other's resolve. John felt the weight of his grandfather's expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. These women had trusted his grandfather with their lives and their secrets, and now they were trusting him to protect what the old man had built. The responsibility was overwhelming, but as he looked at their faces, frightened but determined, vulnerable but not broken, he felt his grandfather's courage flowing through his veins. "Gentlemen," John said, his voice carrying a new authority that surprised even him, "I think it's time for you to leave. Whatever business you think you have here can be conducted through proper legal channels, with proper legal representation present." He moved toward the door, making it clear that the conversation was over, but Crawford wasn't finished. "Think carefully about this decision, Mr. Doe," Crawford said as his companions reluctantly moved toward the door. "We're offering you a chance to resolve this matter quietly, profitably. Turn us down now, and things will become much more complicated for everyone involved." The threat was clear and unambiguous. After the three men had mounted their horses and disappeared into the gathering dusk, the house fell into an oppressive silence. The women looked at each other with the haunted expressions of people who had thought themselves safe, only to discover that their past had finally caught up with them. John realized that his grandfather's work was indeed unfinished, and that the battle for these women's freedom was far from over. Jane moved to the window and watched until the riders disappeared completely before turning back to the group. "They know," she said simply. "They know about the husbands, about what we did, about everything." Her words confirmed what everyone in the room already understood: their carefully constructed new lives were under attack. As the women began to discuss their options in hushed, frightened voices, John retreated to his grandfather's desk and opened the journal once more. Somewhere in these pages, he was certain, lay the key to protecting what his grandfather had built. The old man had been too careful, too thorough to leave such an obvious vulnerability in his defenses. His search was rewarded when he found a hidden compartment in the desk, triggered by a mechanism his grandfather had described in a cryptic journal entry. Inside were additional documents, legal papers, correspondence, and most importantly, a letter addressed to John in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. "My dear boy," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the wolves have finally come for our flock. "Do not despair, for I have prepared for this day as carefully as I prepared for all the others. The men who threaten these women are not what they appear to be, and the truth about them lies in the territorial marshal's office in documents I placed there years ago." John's hands shook as he continued reading. His grandfather had apparently spent years collecting evidence about Crawford and his associates, documenting their involvement in a series of gold robberies that had plagued the territory. The missing husbands had not been innocent victims, but accomplices in these crimes, men whose own criminal activities had made them vulnerable to the very justice they had sought to escape. The letter continued with detailed instructions about how to contact the territorial marshal, what documents to reference, and how to present the evidence in a way that would not only clear the women, but also bring Crawford and his men to justice. His grandfather had laid a trap years in the making, one that required only John's courage to spring. As dawn broke over the ranch, John prepared to ride to the territorial marshal's office, armed with his grandfather's evidence and a newfound understanding of the legacy he had inherited. The women gathered to see him off, their faces showing a mixture of hope and fear that reminded him of the tremendous responsibility he carried. Jane approached as he prepared to mount his horse and placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Your grandfather always said you would understand," she whispered. "He said you had his heart, even if you'd lost your memories. Don't let us down, John. Don't let him down." The ride to town gave John time to process everything he had learned and everything that lay ahead. These women had become his family in ways he was only beginning to understand, and he would not let them face their enemies alone. His grandfather had started something beautiful and necessary, and John would see it finished. The territorial marshal, a grizzled veteran named Tom Bradley, listened with growing amazement as John presented his grandfather's evidence. The documents painted a clear picture of Crawford and his associates as the leaders of a criminal organization that had terrorized the territory for years, using their legitimate business as cover for robbery and worse crimes. When Crawford and his men returned to the ranch that evening, expecting to find frightened women ready to cooperate, they instead found John waiting for them with Marshal Bradley and a federal warrant. The confrontation was brief, but decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, the three men had no choice but to surrender to federal custody. As the criminals were led away in chains, the women of the ranch gathered around John with tears of relief and gratitude streaming down their faces. Jane stepped forward to speak for all of them, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for finishing what your grandfather started, for keeping his promise, for giving us the freedom to live without fear." The other women nodded their agreement, and John saw in their faces the same love and respect they had held for his grandfather. Standing there in the fading light, surrounded by these remarkable women who had become his family, John finally understood what his grandfather had tried to tell him in all those carefully preserved letters and documents. This ranch was more than property or inheritance. It was home in the truest sense, a place where people who had been broken could heal, where those who had been hunted could find safety, and where a man could find his true purpose in protecting those who needed protection. The fever of his childhood had taken away his memories, but it couldn't touch the values his grandfather had instilled in him, or the destiny that had been waiting for him to claim. John Doe had found his place in the world, and he would guard it as fiercely as his grandfather had before him.